So here's something a bit different. Up until conscription was introduced in early 1916, if you were a young fit man or even a slightly older man who was engaged on war work at home in Great Britain, it could be really quite difficult to prove to people, especially those who might want to give you a bit of a hard time, about the fact you were doing your bit for the war effort, especially if you didn't have a uniform to wear. Well, some of us or most of us who study the First World War are quite familiar with the famous sort of white feather movement, or the idea of giving white feathers as a sign of cowardice to men, particularly in public places, who were seen to be the right sort of age to be in uniform and weren't sort of doing their bit, so to speak. So if you were a munitions worker, if you were working in a factory, if you were on, vital war work that might not seem as obvious, if you were, clerking in government offices and things like that, how would you prove to someone who wanted to give you a bit of a hard time that you were actually doing your bit for the war effort? Well, sort of in 1915, they come up with these as a bit of an answer to that. And there are all sorts of versions of the on war service badge, all for varying different times, varying different places, and from different manufacturers. These are just a few examples of those. There's sort of what we might think of as one of the most standard ones, the on war service badge. And you'll notice that most of them have these kind of strange fixings on the back. And the whole idea of that is that it's to go through the buttonhole on the lapel of your jacket. So that if you were going about your business just in your normal civilian suit, in an era where most men were wearing a jacket of a daily basis, you could pin that on and you'd have it there. And so actually people that passed you would know that you were definitely and unquestionably doing your bit. In fact, as we see here on this poster, Lord Derby, and that's the Lord Derby of the famous Derby scheme armbands, gave a speech in October 1915 where he kind of laid out that the War Office, the Admiralty, and the Munitions Department had come to this understanding, had come to this agreement that these things could be issued officially and sort of given to men and later women who were on war service, so to speak. So these are just some examples of these, and the ones that were issued officially, generally you would get a certificate with it and it would be numbered, so that I suppose it made them slightly harder to pilfer and it made them harder to forge as well, because each one was individually numbered, a bit like a soldier's medals would be. You can make a kind of comparison. But one of the most famous, particularly if you're into collecting this sort of stuff, is the triangular on war service badge. And this specifically is not designed for men. It comes in after conscription in 1916, and it's designed only for women engaged on munitions work, all the other things that women were engaged in doing, particularly on the home front. And you can tell this usually because rather than having that fixing for the man's jacket buttonhole, it's got a broached back like a pin that can be worn on a dress or on a shawl, or even on some of the more practical working clothes worn by women in those occupations. A really interesting thing, a really kind of collector's piece nowadays. They actually fetch quite a lot of money in their various forms, but really at the time, a useful thing for making sure that recognition was found where it was deserved.